I woke up that Thursday morning to find my husband's wedding ring on the bathroom counter next to a note that said he needed space. And by the time I finished reading it, I realized the man I'd spent 15 years with had been having an affair with my sister for almost 2 years. My name is Emma Richardson. I'm 38 years old, and I'm about to tell you how the worst betrayal of my life led me to discover who I really was underneath all those years of trying to be the perfect wife, the perfect sister, the perfect daughter. And honestly, if you're going through something similar right now, or you've ever felt invisible in your own life, I really hope you'll stay with me through this story because maybe, just maybe, my experience will help you feel less alone. The morning light was coming through our bedroom window in that pale gray way it does in Seattle during November. And I remember thinking how appropriate it was that even the weather seemed to reflect the emptiness I'd been feeling for months, without really acknowledging it. David had been distant for so long that I'd actually convinced myself it was normal, that all marriages went through phases like this, that his late nights at the office and his constant phone checking and his general disinterest in anything I had to say were just part of growing older together. I held that note in my shaking hands and read it 3 times before the words actually penetrated my brain, and even then, I kept thinking there must be some mistake, some misunderstanding, because my David wouldn't do this to me, and my sister Claire definitely wouldn't betray me like this, except the evidence was right there in his handwriting, telling me he'd fallen in love with someone who understood him better, and that someone was my own flesh and blood. I sat down on the edge of our bed, the bed we'd shared for 15 years, the bed where we'd talked about our dreams and made plans for a future that apparently only I still believed in, and I tried to remember the last time David had really looked at me, really seen me as Emma, and not just as the woman who managed the household and remembered to pay the bills and made sure his mother got her birthday card on time. The truth was, I couldn't remember, and that realization hurt almost as much as the betrayal itself, because somewhere along the way, I'd become invisible even to myself. Before I could spiral too deep into that dark place, my phone rang, and of course it was my mother calling to ask if I'd talked to Claire, because apparently my sister had been acting strange lately and Mom was worried, and I had to bite my tongue so hard I tasted blood to keep from screaming that yes, Claire was acting strange because she was sleeping with my husband. Instead, I told Mom I'd check in with Claire later and ended the call as quickly as I could, because I needed time to process this nuclear bomb that had just exploded my entire existence. If you're watching this and finding some value in hearing about how messy real life can be, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a second to hit that subscribe button below, because sharing these stories and building this community of people who support each other through difficult times is incredibly important to me, and we're working toward that goal of 1,000 subscribers who believe in authentic storytelling. I spent the rest of that Thursday in a fog, calling in sick to my job at the marketing firm where I'd worked for 7 years doing decent work that never got me promoted because I was reliable Emma, who would always be there to pick up the slack when someone else needed coverage. My boss Karen barely reacted when I said I had a stomach bug, just asked if I'd be back Friday because we had a client presentation, and I said yes, automatically, even though I had no idea if I'd ever be able to function normally again. The house felt different that day, like every corner held evidence of my failure to keep my husband happy, and I wandered from room to room seeing everything with new eyes, noticing how few of David's things were actually there anymore, realizing he must have been gradually moving his stuff out, and I'd been too distracted or too desperate to maintain the illusion of normalcy to even notice. In the kitchen, I found the coffee maker he'd bought me for our 10th anniversary, because I'd mentioned wanting to make better coffee at home. And I remembered how pleased I'd been with that gift, how I'd interpreted it as him caring about the small things that mattered to me. But now I wondered if it had just been guilt making him try to be a better husband, even while he was betraying me with my sister. I made myself a cup of coffee using that machine, and it tasted bitter despite the expensive beans I'd bought, and I stood there by the kitchen window looking out at our neighbor's garden where everything was dying back for winter, and thought about how appropriate that metaphor was for my marriage. By evening I'd cried myself dry, and moved into a kind of numb acceptance that my life as I knew it was over, and I kept checking my phone expecting David to call or text or show up to explain himself. But there was nothing, just silence that felt deliberate and cruel. Claire didn't reach out either, which somehow hurt even more because we'd been close growing up, or at least I thought we'd been close, sharing secrets and supporting each other through Mom and Dad's divorce when we were teenagers, and standing up for each other when kids at school were mean. But apparently all of that sisterly bond meant nothing compared to whatever she'd found with my husband. I ordered takeout Chinese food because I couldn't imagine cooking anything, and when it arrived, I couldn't eat more than a few bites because my stomach was churning with anger and hurt and disbelief. So I ended up sitting on the couch with mindless television playing in the background while I tried to figure out what to do next. The practical side of my brain started making lists, the way I always did when life felt overwhelming, lists of lawyers to call and friends to confide in, and steps to take to separate my life from David's. But underneath all that practical planning was a deeper question that kept circling back, which was who was I without this marriage, and without my role as David's wife, and without the identity I'd built my entire adult life around. That night I barely slept, lying in bed alternating between rage and grief. And somewhere around 3 a.m, I got up and went to David's closet and saw that yes, definitely, a significant portion of his clothes were gone. Suits and shirts and shoes he must have been removing bit by bit while I was at work or running errands, or existing in my oblivious bubble. I pulled out my phone and almost called him a dozen times, but stopped myself each time because what would I even say? And more importantly, did I really want to hear him tell me all the ways I'd failed to be enough for him? All the ways Claire was better and more exciting and more whatever it was that I apparently wasn't. Instead, I texted my best friend Sarah even though it was the middle of the night, just typed out the basics of what had happened, and within minutes, she was calling me, her voice thick with sleep, but instantly alert with concern. And just hearing someone say, "Oh my God, Emma, I'm so sorry this is happening to you," made me start crying again, because at least someone acknowledged that this was a terrible thing, and not somehow my fault for not being a good enough wife. Friday morning came too fast, and I dragged myself to work because I'd promised Karen I'd be there, and because some part of me clung to routine as a life raft in the storm that was drowning me. My coworkers could tell something was wrong, but I deflected their questions with vague comments about not feeling well, and I made it through the client presentation on autopilot, smiling and nodding and saying all the right things, while inside I was screaming. During my lunch break, I sat in my car in the parking garage and finally worked up the courage to call David. And when he answered, his voice was careful and distant, and he said, "Emma, we need to talk, but not now. I need more time to figure things out." And I said, "You need time. You've already had 2 years with my sister to figure things out while I was living in ignorance." And he got defensive, saying it wasn't like that. It just happened. They'd connected at a family barbecue last summer, and one thing led to another, and I wanted to reach through the phone and shake him because nothing just happens. People make choices, and he'd chosen to betray me day after day for months and months. He promised we'd sit down and discuss everything properly soon, maybe next week, and then he hung up, leaving me alone in my car, feeling like I was fragmenting into 1,000 pieces that would never fit back together the same way. That afternoon, Sarah showed up at my office with coffee and insisted on taking me out after work, and we ended up at this small cafe near Pike Place Market that I'd never been to before, tucked away on a side street where tourists rarely wandered. The place had exposed brick walls and mismatched furniture, and the smell of fresh-baked pastries, and Sarah ordered us both cappuccinos and these enormous chocolate croissants and told me to eat because I looked like I'd lost weight already, and it had only been 2 days. We sat in a corner booth, and I told her everything, every horrible detail, and she listened without interrupting, except to occasionally mutter that David was a selfish asshole and Claire was dead to her now, and it felt good to have someone unequivocally on my side without any of that. Maybe you should think about what you could have done differently. Nonsense. Sarah had been my friend since college. We'd met in a sociology class and bonded over our shared love of true crime podcasts and our tendency to overthink everything. And she'd been through her own divorce 3 years ago, so she understood the particular hell of having your life implode when you thought everything was fine. While we were talking, the guy behind the counter kept glancing over at our table, and at first I thought maybe we were being too loud. But then I realized he seemed concerned rather than annoyed. And when he brought over a plate of complimentary biscotti, he said, "You two look like you're having the kind of conversation that requires cookies." And despite everything, I managed a small smile. His name tag said Marcus, and he had kind eyes, and one of those faces that made you think he probably volunteered at animal shelters in his spare time. And when Sarah excused herself to take a work call outside, Marcus came back over and asked if I was okay, because I looked like I'd been crying, and normally I would have brushed off that kind of question from a stranger, but something about his genuine concern made me tell him the abbreviated version of my story. He listened quietly while wiping down the table next to ours, and when I finished, he said, "I'm sorry that happened to you. You deserve better than that." And those simple words hit me harder than I expected, because I couldn't remember the last time anyone had told me I deserved better, including myself. If you're still with me in this story and you're finding it relatable or moving or helpful in any way, please consider subscribing to the channel, because building a community where we can share these real human experiences is what this is all about. And every new subscriber helps us reach more people who might need to hear that they're not alone in their struggles. Over the next week, I moved through my days like a ghost, going through the motions of normal life while internally preparing for the divorce that seemed inevitable. I hired a lawyer, a sharp woman named Patricia, who specialized in infidelity cases, and who assured me that Washington was a no-fault divorce state, but that David's affair would definitely factor into any settlement discussions. I told my mother about the separation, but not about Claire's involvement, because I couldn't bring myself to shatter her illusions about her daughters quite yet. And Mom immediately went into fix-it mode, suggesting marriage counseling, and reminding me that all couples go through rough patches, completely missing the point that this wasn't a rough patch, but a fundamental betrayal. I'd been avoiding Claire's calls and texts, and she'd sent several messages saying we needed to talk, and she could explain everything, and she never meant to hurt me, and I wanted to respond with all the vicious things crowding my mind, but I also wanted to maintain some dignity in this nightmare, so I just blocked her number instead. My work performance was definitely suffering. I'd missed deadlines and zoned out during meetings, and generally stopped caring about campaigns for products I didn't use marketed to people I didn't know. And Karen called me into her office one afternoon to ask if everything was all right at home, because my recent work hadn't been up to my usual standards. I gave her a sanitized version of events, just that my marriage was ending, and I was dealing with some personal stuff. And she made sympathetic noises, but also made it clear that she needed me to get it together, because the team was counting on me. And I nodded and said, "Of course," and went back to my desk feeling even more invisible and replaceable than before. That night I went back to the cafe where I'd met Marcus, partly because I liked the quiet atmosphere, and partly because something about his kindness had stuck with me, and he was there again working the evening shift, and when he saw me, he smiled and said, "Welcome back." Same order as last time, and I was surprised he remembered. I sat in the same corner booth with my laptop pretending to work on a client proposal, but really just staring at the screen. And after the cafe emptied out around 8, Marcus brought over another cappuccino and asked if he could sit down for a minute during his break. We started talking, and it turned out he owned the cafe, had opened it 5 years ago after leaving a corporate job in finance because he'd been miserable pushing papers and wanted to create a space where people could feel comfortable and welcomed. And I found myself telling him more about my situation, about feeling invisible, and wondering who I was outside of my failed marriage. He told me about his own divorce, how his ex-wife had left him for someone with more money and more status, and how he'd spent a year thinking he was worthless, before realizing that her leaving said more about what she valued than about his actual worth as a person. And something about hearing his story made my own pain feel slightly less overwhelming, because here was someone who'd survived and built something meaningful afterward. We talked until closing time, and I helped him wipe down tables and put chairs up. And when we finally left, he walked me to my car and said, "I hope you'll come back, because you seem like someone who could use a friend right now, and I make a pretty decent friend when I'm not making coffee." I drove home feeling lighter than I had in days, not happy exactly, but less crushed by the weight of everything. And I realized that this was the first real conversation I'd had in months, where I felt seen and heard and valued just for being myself. That night, I slept better than I had since finding David's note. And I woke up Saturday morning with something almost like energy. Like maybe I could survive this after all. And maybe there was a version of my life on the other side that could be good in ways I hadn't imagined. The weekend passed in a blur of apartment hunting, because I'd decided I couldn't stay in the house I'd shared with David, couldn't keep walking past rooms full of memories that now felt tainted, and I looked at depressing studio apartments with weird smells and overpriced one-bedrooms with no natural light before finding a small but charming place in Capitol Hill, with hardwood floors and big windows, and a neighborhood coffee shop on the corner. I put down a deposit even though it would stretch my budget because I needed a fresh start somewhere that didn't echo with the ghost of my marriage, and I scheduled movers for the following weekend to collect my stuff while David was out, because Patricia, my lawyer, had advised me to get my personal belongings secured before things got potentially ugly with the divorce proceedings. Sarah helped me pack on Sunday, and we sorted through 15 years of accumulated life, deciding what I wanted to keep and what could be left behind. And I found myself creating 3 piles: keep, donate, and burn in effigy. And that last pile was mostly wedding photos and anniversary cards and anything Claire had given me over the years. Monday at work, I submitted my 2 weeks' notice because I'd realized that job was another thing making me invisible. Another place where I'd shrunk myself down to fit into a role that didn't actually value who I was. And Karen tried to talk me out of it, offering a small raise and more flexibility, but I told her my decision was final because I needed to make space for something new, even if I didn't know what that something was yet. My coworkers were shocked. Reliable Emma, who never made waves, was walking away without another job lined up, and I could see them wondering if I was having some kind of breakdown. But I felt clearer about this decision than I'd felt about anything in years. That evening, I went back to Marcus's cafe because it had become my refuge, my safe space away from the chaos of dismantling my old life. And he greeted me with that warm smile that was becoming familiar and comforting. And we fell into easy conversation during his breaks about books we were reading and places we wanted to travel, and what it meant to start over when you thought your life was supposed to go a completely different direction. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I developed a friendship that felt both new and oddly familiar, like we'd known each other in some previous version of our lives, and I started spending almost every evening at the cafe working on my laptop or reading or just sitting and people-watching while he worked. He introduced me to his regular customers, a mix of artists and students and neighborhood characters who treated the cafe like their living room, and I felt myself slowly becoming part of this community in a way I'd never experienced before. Marcus told me stories about each regular, like the elderly man who came in every morning at 6 for black coffee and always left a $5 tip, or the college student who studied there every afternoon and survived primarily on espresso and determination, and I started to see how he'd created not just a business, but a gathering place where people felt they belonged. I told him about my marriage, about the slow erosion of connection that I'd ignored because I was too busy being accommodating and understanding and giving David space to figure out whatever he needed to figure out, which apparently was that he wanted my sister instead of me. Marcus never told me what I should feel or how I should handle things. He just listened and sometimes shared his own experiences, and occasionally made me laugh with dry observations about the absurdity of human behavior. And I realized I was healing in tiny increments with each conversation. I moved into my new apartment on a Saturday with Sarah's help, and a couple of guys from a moving service who hauled boxes up 3 flights of stairs without complaining. And that night, I sat on my bare floor surrounded by unpacked boxes eating pizza, and feeling terrified and exhilarated in equal measure, because this place was mine, purely mine. No shared history or compromises, or pretending to like David's modern minimalist aesthetic when I preferred cozy chaos. Marcus had given me a housewarming gift, a French press and a bag of his cafe's signature coffee blend, and the card said "For new beginnings, from your friend Marcus." And I may have cried a little reading that because kindness from unexpected sources hits different when you're rebuilding yourself from scratch. David finally agreed to meet me in person about 10 days after I'd moved out. And we sat in a lawyer's office with Patricia on my side and David's attorney on his, and the whole thing was sterile and uncomfortable, and nothing like how I'd imagined ending a 15-year marriage. David looked tired and a little guilty, but also defensive, and when Patricia brought up the affair with Claire, he tried to minimize it, saying it wasn't relevant to the divorce proceedings. But Patricia was fierce and made it very relevant by pointing out the timeline and the breach of trust and the emotional damage. And I sat there feeling numb and disconnected, watching these professionals discuss the dismantling of my life in legal terminology. We agreed on a preliminary separation of assets, and David didn't fight me on keeping most of the furniture since he'd apparently already moved in with Claire, which was information that hit me like a punch to the gut even though I'd suspected it. And when the meeting ended, David asked if we could talk privately for a minute, and against my better judgment, I agreed. We stood in the parking lot outside the law office, and David said, "Emma, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened, and I couldn't help how I felt." And I looked at him, this man I'd loved since I was 23, and I said, "You could have helped it. You could have been honest. You could have ended things with me before starting something with my sister." And he didn't have a good response to that, so he just looked at his shoes like a guilty child. I asked him if he loved Claire, and he said yes, which hurt. But at least it was honest. And I asked if he'd ever really loved me, and he said of course he had. But we'd grown apart, and I'd become so focused on managing everything that there wasn't room for spontaneity or passion anymore. And I wanted to scream that I'd been managing everything because he'd checked out. Because someone had to pay the bills and remember appointments and keep life functioning. But I was too tired to fight. So I just said, "I hope you're happy, David. I really do." And I walked away, leaving him standing there in the parking lot looking confused that I wasn't falling apart. If this story is resonating with you, or if you know someone going through something similar, I hope you'll consider subscribing to this channel, because creating content about real-life experiences and building a supportive community is how we help each other navigate these difficult transitions. And your subscription really does make a difference in reaching our goal of 1,000 people who believe in authentic storytelling. I drove back to my new apartment that afternoon, and instead of feeling devastated, I felt relieved because that chapter was truly closing, and I could see the shape of my future starting to emerge, even if I didn't know all the details yet. I stopped by Marcus's cafe on the way home, and he took one look at my face and made me his special lavender honey latte and came to sit with me. And I told him about the meeting with David and the conversation afterward. And Marcus said something I'll never forget. He said, "Emma, you've been trying to make yourself smaller to fit into other people's expectations your whole life. Maybe it's time to figure out how big you actually are." That night I unpacked more boxes in my apartment and started arranging things the way I wanted them. Not the way David would have preferred, or the way magazine spreads suggested, but in a way that felt like me. With books stacked on every surface, and art prints I'd been saving for years, finally hung on walls in colors that made me happy, instead of neutrals that made the space feel sterile. Sarah came over with wine and helped me assemble furniture, and we laughed about how neither of us was particularly handy, but we were determined to figure out these IKEA instructions without needing a man's help. And there was something deeply satisfying about building my new life literally with my own hands. Over the following weeks, I fell into new rhythms, morning walks through Capitol Hill to my favorite bagel place, afternoons spent applying for jobs that actually interested me instead of just tolerable positions, evenings at Marcus's cafe where I was no longer just a customer, but part of the fabric of the place. I started taking a creative writing class at a community college, because I'd always loved writing but had convinced myself it was impractical, and my teacher was this intense woman in her 60s, who said on the first day that we all had stories worth telling, and the only question was whether we were brave enough to tell them honestly. I wrote about my marriage, and the betrayal, and the process of discovering who I was outside of being someone's wife, and my classmates' responses were incredibly validating. Several people saying they'd felt invisible in their own lives, and my words helped them feel less alone, and I realized that maybe my pain could be transformed into something meaningful if I was willing to be vulnerable about it. Marcus read some of my writing and encouraged me to keep going, said I had a voice that was both relatable and unique, and coming from someone whose opinion I'd grown to value highly, that encouragement meant everything. The divorce moved forward with typical legal slowness, paperwork, and waiting periods, and negotiations over assets that should have been simple, but got complicated because David's lawyer was aggressive, and Patricia had to keep reminding everyone that David's affair was documented and relevant. I still hadn't confronted Claire directly, hadn't spoken to her since before I found out about the betrayal, and my mother kept asking why the two of us weren't talking. And when I finally told her the truth, she was devastated and refused to believe it at first, until I showed her screenshots of texts between David and Claire that I'd found on our shared tablet before moving out. Mom cried and apologized and asked what she could have done differently raising us, and I told her this wasn't her fault, that Claire was an adult who'd made terrible choices, and David was an adult who'd done the same, and sometimes people we love disappoint us in ways we never see coming. Right around the 3-month mark after David left, I got a job offer from a small digital marketing agency that specialized in nonprofits, and the salary was slightly less than my previous position, but the mission aligned with my values, and the interview process made me feel like they actually cared about who I was as a person, not just my skill set. I accepted immediately, and gave myself a weekend to celebrate before starting. And Marcus closed the cafe early on Saturday night, and we went to this little Italian restaurant in Ballard that he'd been wanting to try. And it felt like a date, even though neither of us acknowledged it as such. Just two friends celebrating new beginnings, except there was definitely something more hovering in the air between us. We talked about everything and nothing, shared a bottle of wine and split a tiramisu, and when he walked me to my car, he said, "Emma, I really enjoy spending time with you, and I'd like to do this again, maybe officially as a date if you're interested." And my heart started racing, because I hadn't thought about dating, hadn't thought about being ready for anything like that. But looking at Marcus with his kind eyes and genuine smile, I realized maybe I was more ready than I'd thought. I told him I needed to think about it because I didn't want to rush into something new while still processing everything old. And he said, "Of course, take your time. I'm not going anywhere." And he gave me a hug that lasted just a beat longer than a friendly hug. And I drove home feeling scared and excited and alive in a way I hadn't felt in years. I talked to Sarah about it the next day, and she was firmly in the go for it camp, pointing out that I'd been grieving my marriage for longer than just the 3 months since David left, that I'd actually been grieving it for years while trying to pretend everything was fine. And maybe I'd done enough processing to at least explore what something new might feel like. I spent the week thinking about it, about whether I was attracted to Marcus, or just grateful for his friendship during a difficult time. And I realized it was both, and that was okay, that complicated feelings were normal, and I didn't need to have everything figured out before taking a small step forward. The following Saturday, I went to the cafe near closing time, and waited until Marcus finished with his last customers, and when we were alone, I said yes. I would like to go on an official date with you, and his face lit up in a way that made my stomach flip, and we made plans for the following Friday night. That week crawled by with nervous anticipation, mixed with anxiety about whether I was ready, and what if it was weird, and what if our friendship got ruined, if things didn't work out romantically. But I tried to quiet those voices, and just trust that I deserved to explore happiness wherever I might find it. Friday came, and Marcus picked me up at my apartment, and he'd dressed up slightly, which was adorable. And we went to a live music venue where a local band was playing acoustic covers of 90s songs. And we drank craft beer and sang along badly and laughed until my cheeks hurt. And afterward, we walked along the waterfront, even though it was cold because neither of us wanted the night to end. He told me more about his life, about growing up in Portland, with parents who'd always supported his dreams, even when those dreams seemed impractical. About his marriage that had fallen apart when his ex-wife decided she wanted a different life than the one they were building together. About the fear and liberation of starting his cafe and putting everything into creating something that was purely his vision. I told him about growing up trying to be the good daughter and the perfect student, and later the ideal wife, about how exhausting it was to constantly mold yourself to other people's expectations, about the strange freedom that came from having your life completely explode, because at least in the rubble you could start rebuilding according to your own blueprint. When he dropped me off at my apartment, he walked me to my door and asked if he could kiss me. And I said yes, and it was gentle and sweet and terrifying, because it had been so long since I'd kissed anyone but David. And this was Marcus, who was becoming increasingly important to me. And when we pulled apart, he said, "I've wanted to do that for weeks," and I admitted me too. We started dating officially after that, taking things slow because we both understood that I was still technically married, even though the divorce was in progress, and we needed to be careful with each other's hearts, and it was the healthiest relationship dynamic I'd ever experienced. Marcus never pressured me to move faster than I was comfortable with, never made me feel guilty for needing space to process my emotions, never tried to be anything other than authentically himself. And I tried to show up the same way, honest about my fears and my healing process, and my occasional moments of grief for what I'd lost, even though I knew ending things with David was right. We spent our time doing simple things, cooking dinner at my apartment or his house, visiting farmers markets and bookstores and art galleries, having long conversations about philosophy and politics, and what we wanted our lives to look like 5 years from now. And I felt myself slowly transforming into someone who knew her own mind and trusted her own instincts. My new job was challenging in good ways, working with organizations that were trying to make actual positive change in the world, and I threw myself into campaigns for housing nonprofits and environmental groups and social justice initiatives. And for the first time in my career, I felt like my work mattered beyond just moving products or increasing market share. My boss, Elena, was supportive and collaborative, treated everyone on the team like their input was valuable, and I thrived in that environment in ways I never had at my previous job, where being reliable had been more important than being creative. I started getting positive feedback from clients and recognition within the agency, and Elena pulled me aside one day to say she saw real leadership potential in me and wanted to discuss a path toward project management if I was interested. And I said yes immediately, because finally someone was seeing me not as background support, but as someone capable of more. Around month 5 of my separation from David, Claire showed up at my apartment unannounced, and I opened the door to find my sister standing there looking nervous and guilty and desperate. And she said, "Emma, please, I need to talk to you. I can't live with this silence anymore." And I stood in the doorway debating whether to slam the door in her face or let her in. And ultimately, I let her in because avoiding this conversation forever wasn't actually healing. It was just postponing the inevitable. We sat in my living room with careful space between us, and Claire started talking, explaining how the affair had started innocently enough with her and David bonding over feeling stuck in their respective lives, how she'd never meant for it to become physical. But once it did, she'd felt too guilty to stop it, and too infatuated to want to. How she'd told herself they'd end things before I ever found out. But then months kept passing, and she kept justifying it. And David kept making promises about leaving me that he didn't keep until finally he did. I listened without interrupting, and then I told her everything I'd been holding in for months. How betrayed I felt, not just by David, but especially by her, because sisters were supposed to protect each other, not destroy each other. How our entire history together now felt suspect, because if she could do this, what else had she been capable of? How I didn't know if I could ever forgive her, even though part of me wanted to, because she was still my sister, and cutting her out meant losing family, which I'd already lost with David. Claire cried and apologized, and said she understood if I hated her, that she hated herself most days, that her relationship with David was already falling apart, because it had been built on betrayal and guilt, and they couldn't trust each other because they both knew what the other was capable of. And I felt a grim satisfaction hearing that, even though it didn't really make me feel better. I told her I needed more time, that I wasn't ready to forgive or rebuild our relationship, that maybe someday we could find a way back to being sisters. But right now I needed to focus on healing myself without worrying about her feelings. And she nodded and left, and I closed the door and cried, because sometimes there's grief, even in setting necessary boundaries. If you're still here listening to my story, and you found something valuable in these honest reflections about betrayal and healing and starting over, I really hope you'll take a moment to subscribe to the channel, because reaching 1,000 subscribers means we can continue building this community of people who support each other through life's hardest moments. And every subscription genuinely helps us grow this space for authentic connection. After Claire's visit, I felt emotionally exhausted, but also lighter in some way. Like that confrontation had released pressure that had been building for months. And I called Marcus, and he came over with takeout Thai food and just sat with me while I processed everything. He didn't try to fix anything or offer solutions, just listened and held my hand and reminded me that healing wasn't linear, and I was allowed to have complicated feelings about everyone involved, including myself, and that presence was exactly what I needed. The divorce was finalized on a Tuesday morning in early spring, almost 7 months after David had left that note on the bathroom counter. And I went to the courthouse with Patricia and signed papers that officially ended my marriage. And David was there with his lawyer, but we didn't speak beyond the necessary legal formalities. Walking out of that courthouse, I felt strange. Not sad exactly, but aware of a significant shift. Like I'd just closed a very long chapter, and the next chapter was completely blank pages waiting to be written. I went to Marcus's cafe afterward, and he'd made a special cake with Emma's new beginning written in frosting. And some of the regulars were there, and they all cheered when I walked in. And I realized I'd built a new community in this neighborhood cafe that felt more like family than my actual family did at the moment. Marcus and I had been dating for about 3 months by then, and things between us were deepening in ways that felt both exciting and terrifying. And one evening at his house after dinner, he told me he was falling in love with me, and he wanted me to know, but I didn't need to say anything back until I was ready. I sat with those words for a long moment, thinking about how different this felt from my relationship with David. How Marcus saw me completely and loved what he saw, rather than loving an idealized version he'd imagined. And I realized I was falling in love with him too, even though part of me was still scared of trusting someone new with my heart. I told him I loved him too, but I needed us to keep taking things slow, because I was still learning who I was outside of my marriage, and I didn't want to lose myself again in another relationship. And he said that was exactly what he wanted too. 2 whole people choosing each other rather than 2 incomplete people trying to fill each other's gaps. My relationship with my mother slowly repaired over the following months as she came to terms with Claire's betrayal and stopped trying to push me toward forgiveness before I was ready. And Mom and I started having regular coffee dates where we talked about more honest things than we'd ever discussed before. About her own regrets and disappointments, and how she'd stayed in an unhappy marriage with my father for too long, because she didn't think she had other options. And I shared my experiences with therapy, and rebuilding, and learning to trust my own judgment. She met Marcus and liked him immediately. Said he seemed kind and genuine, and that he looked at me the way someone should look at a person they love, with respect and admiration and delight. And having my mother's approval meant more than I'd expected, even though I would have dated him regardless. Work continued to be a source of growth and satisfaction, and after about 8 months at the agency, Elena promoted me to project manager with a significant salary increase and more responsibility. And I found I was good at leading teams and managing complex campaigns and solving problems creatively. My coworkers seemed to respect me not as reliable background Emma, but as someone with valuable ideas and strong instincts. And I started speaking up more in meetings and advocating for my vision, and pushing back when something didn't feel right, instead of just going along to avoid conflict. Sarah said she barely recognized this version of me in the best way possible, that I seemed more confident and present and genuinely happy than she'd seen me in years. And I felt that too. Felt like I was finally inhabiting my own life rather than watching it happen to me. Around the 1-year anniversary of David leaving, I realized I'd gone several days without thinking about him or the affair or the marriage that had ended. And that felt significant, like I'd finally released the hold those events had on my daily consciousness. Marcus and I had been together for 7 months, and we'd started talking about moving in together eventually, though we weren't rushing it, both of us wanting to be sure we were making decisions based on genuine readiness rather than loneliness or convenience. I'd reconnected tentatively with Claire after months of distance, not fully trusting her, but willing to try rebuilding some kind of relationship, because she was my sister, and family was complicated, and people made terrible mistakes. But that didn't necessarily mean they were beyond redemption, though I knew our relationship would never be what it had been before, and I'd made peace with that. I ran into David once at a grocery store about 14 months after our divorce was finalized, and it was awkward but not devastating, and he looked tired and asked how I was doing, and I said, I was good, actually really good. And I meant it. He mentioned that he and Claire had broken up, which I'd heard through my mother, and there was a moment where he seemed like he wanted to say something else, maybe an apology or an expression of regret. But I didn't need to hear it anymore, so I said it was good to see him doing well, and I had to get going. And I left him standing there in the produce section, and I felt absolutely nothing, which was its own kind of freedom. I told Marcus about it later, and he asked if seeing David had brought up difficult emotions, and I said honestly, no. It felt like encountering someone I used to know rather than someone who still had power over my happiness. And Marcus smiled and said, that's real healing right there. My writing had continued through all of this. I'd finished the community college class and started working on a longer memoir-style project about marriage and betrayal and self-discovery. And I'd shared some chapters with a small writing group I'd joined, and the feedback had been encouraging. One woman in the group who worked in publishing said I should consider finding an agent because my voice was compelling, and my story would resonate with a lot of people. And while that seemed like a distant dream, it was nice to imagine a future where my painful experiences could be transformed into something that might help others feel less alone in their own struggles. I kept going to therapy regularly because I'd learned that maintaining my mental health required ongoing work, not just crisis intervention, and my therapist helped me process not just the betrayal, but the deeper patterns that had led me to make myself small and accommodating in the first place. Patterns that went back to childhood and family dynamics and messages about what made women valuable. As I approached the 2-year mark since David had left, I threw a small party at my apartment celebrating not the anniversary of my marriage ending, but the anniversary of my new life beginning, and I invited Marcus and Sarah and people from work, and my writing group and my favorite regulars from the cafe, and my mother came too, and we filled my small space with laughter and good food and genuine connection. Marcus gave a toast saying he'd never met someone as brave as me, willing to completely rebuild her life from the ground up and come out stronger and more herself on the other side. And I looked around at this community I'd built and this life I'd created, and I felt genuinely proud of myself for the first time in longer than I could remember. Someone asked me if I'd ever imagined my life turning out this way, and I said honestly no. I thought I'd stay married to David forever and keep working at that same company and keep being invisible and accommodating until I disappeared entirely. And losing everything had forced me to figure out who I actually was underneath all those layers of people-pleasing. And that had been the most painful and most valuable thing that ever happened to me. Later that night, after everyone had left and it was just Marcus and me cleaning up, he said he had something to ask me, and he looked nervous, and I thought, oh God, he's going to propose and I'm not ready for that. But instead, he asked if I'd like to take a trip with him to Portugal in the fall, because he'd always wanted to go, and he wanted to share that experience with me. And I said yes immediately, because adventures with him sounded exactly right. And he seemed relieved and happy. And we spent the rest of the evening looking at travel sites and making plans. We ended up on my couch talking until 2 a.m. about all the places we wanted to see and experiences we wanted to have, and how wild it was that we'd both had our lives completely upended and somehow found each other in the wreckage and built something new and good together. I'd learned so much in those 2 years about resilience and self-worth, and the difference between being alone and being lonely, about how betrayal could either destroy you or become the catalyst for becoming who you were always meant to be if you were willing to do the hard work of healing. I'd learned that forgiveness was complicated and didn't always look like reconciliation, that you could acknowledge someone hurt you deeply, while also releasing the power that hurt had over your present and future. I'd learned that community wasn't just about family you were born into, but about people you chose and who chose you back. About showing up authentically and vulnerably and trusting that the right people would appreciate what they found. I'd learned that career success meant something different when you were doing work that aligned with your values, that money and status weren't worth sacrificing your sense of purpose and integrity. Most importantly, I'd learned that I was enough exactly as I was, that I didn't need to shrink or accommodate or mold myself to fit someone else's vision of who I should be, that the right people would love me, not despite my quirks and complications, but because of them. Marcus saw me completely, all my messy emotions and unresolved issues and evolving sense of self, and he loved me not as a project to fix, but as a whole person worthy of respect and care and genuine partnership. That was what I'd been missing in my marriage to David, that sense of being truly seen and valued. And once I experienced what it felt like to be in a healthy relationship, I understood just how much I'd been settling for before. If this story has meant something to you, if you've seen yourself in my journey, or found hope in hearing how someone can rebuild after devastating betrayal, please consider subscribing to this channel, because sharing these authentic experiences and creating a community of support is what this is all about. And we're so close to our goal of 1,000 subscribers who believe in the power of honest storytelling. Looking back now from this vantage point of having rebuilt my entire life, I can see how every painful moment was necessary, how David leaving was actually him doing me a favor even though it didn't feel that way at the time, how Claire's betrayal forced me to examine what real loyalty and love meant, how losing my identity as David's wife created space for me to discover my identity as simply Emma, complete and valuable all on her own. I won't pretend it was easy, or that there weren't days I wanted to give up, mornings I couldn't get out of bed, or nights I cried until I thought I'd run out of tears, moments I questioned whether I'd ever feel normal again, or if this pain would be my new permanent state. But I kept moving forward one small step at a time, kept showing up for therapy and for work and for my friendships, kept writing and processing and slowly rebuilding my sense of self-worth that had been eroded over years of making myself smaller. And gradually, so gradually I almost didn't notice it happening, I started feeling lighter and stronger and more like myself than I'd felt in over a decade. The version of Emma who'd been married to David feels like a different person now, someone I can look back on with compassion, but someone I wouldn't want to be again. That Emma was always looking outside herself for validation and worth, always trying to read other people's needs and meet them before they were even expressed, always terrified of conflict or disappointment, or being seen as difficult or demanding. This Emma, the one who emerged from the wreckage of betrayal and divorce, knows her own mind and trusts her own instincts, and isn't afraid to take up space and have opinions, and sometimes disappoint people in pursuit of being authentic. This Emma has friends who truly know her, and a partner who sees her completely, and work that engages her mind and values, and hobbies that bring joy, just because they're interesting, not because they're productive or impressive to anyone else. Marcus and I did eventually move in together about 6 months after that party, finding a house in Fremont with a big kitchen and a yard, and enough space for both of us to have our own work areas. And living together has been surprisingly easy, because we'd taken the time to know each other thoroughly before combining our lives. We've had disagreements, of course, normal couple conflicts about division of household labor, and how to spend holidays, and whether to get a dog. But we've worked through them with communication and compromise and genuine respect for each other's perspectives. And I've learned that disagreement doesn't mean dissolution, that healthy relationships can survive and even strengthen through conflict when both people are committed to understanding rather than winning. I finished my book manuscript about 3 years after David left, and with help from that woman in my writing group, I found an agent who loved the project and we're currently submitting to publishers. And whether it gets published or not, I'm proud of the work I did, transforming my pain into something meaningful. The process of writing it all down, of examining my marriage and the betrayal, and my journey toward healing with clear eyes and honest reflection, helped me process things I'd been carrying without fully understanding them. And in the end, the book became less about David and Claire's betrayal, and more about my own journey toward self-discovery and empowerment. My agent thinks it will resonate with women who've felt invisible in their own lives, whether because of marriage or career or family dynamics. Women who need permission to stop accommodating and start advocating for themselves. And if the book helps even one person feel less alone or more empowered to make changes, it will have been worth the vulnerability of sharing my story. Claire and I have settled into a cordial but distant relationship. We see each other at family gatherings and exchange pleasantries and sometimes have superficial conversations. But we're not close the way we once were. and I've accepted that some betrayals change relationships permanently, even with forgiveness and time. She's moved to California for work, which makes the physical distance match the emotional distance, and my mother has stopped trying to force a reconciliation between us, understanding finally that some things can't be fixed just because we want them to be. I don't hate Claire anymore. I've worked through that anger in therapy and private journaling and long conversations with Sarah and Marcus. But I also don't trust her with the vulnerable parts of myself, and I probably never will again. And that's okay, because not everyone deserves access to our inner worlds, even if they're family. My relationship with my mother has actually deepened through all of this. We talk more honestly now about her own experiences with marriage and divorce, and the ways she wishes she'd advocated for herself more when she was younger. And she's become one of my biggest cheerleaders in my new life, proud of the career success and the healthy relationship and the creative pursuits I've allowed myself to explore. She loves Marcus, considers him the son-in-law she should have had from the beginning. And sometimes I see her watching us interact with this wistful expression, like she's imagining what her own life might have looked like if she'd had a partner who truly saw her and valued her input and treated her as an equal. Work continues to be fulfilling. I've been promoted again to senior project manager, and I mentor younger team members now, particularly women who seem uncertain about their own abilities or hesitant to advocate for themselves, and I try to share what I've learned about finding your voice and trusting your instincts and not shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. Elena has become not just a boss, but a genuine mentor and friend, someone I can talk to about career strategy and work-life balance and the particular challenges women face in professional spaces. And I'm grateful for her guidance and support in ways I never was with my previous boss, who saw me only as a useful cog in the machine. The cafe where Marcus and I first really connected remains a special place for us. We still go there regularly even though we live together now, treating it as our spot to reconnect and remember where we started. And Marcus has expanded the business, opening a second location in Ballard and talking about maybe a third in the future. I help him with marketing strategy and social media presence, combining my professional skills with my personal investment in seeing him succeed. And it's nice to work together on something that matters to both of us, without the power dynamics or resentment that could poison other couple business ventures. I've also developed new friendships through my writing group and work and the neighborhood, building a network of women who support each other through various life transitions and challenges. And I've learned that female friendship at this age looks different than it did in college or early adulthood. It's less about constant contact and more about showing up for the important moments, less about surface-level fun, and more about authentic vulnerability and mutual support. These women have held space for my grief and celebrated my victories and called me on my bullshit when I've needed it. And I try to offer the same to them, creating a community of care that feels essential to my continued growth and happiness. Looking at my life now compared to where I was 4 years ago when David left that note on the bathroom counter, the transformation is almost unrecognizable, and I'm proud of every difficult step that got me here. I'm proud of leaving the job that undervalued me and finding work that challenges and fulfills me. Proud of having the courage to date Marcus when I was still healing and scared. Proud of setting boundaries with Claire even though it was painful. Proud of all the therapy sessions and writing exercises and honest conversations that slowly rebuilt my sense of self-worth. I'm proud of being able to sit with discomfort instead of rushing to fix or numb it. Proud of learning that I could survive devastating betrayal and come out stronger on the other side. The most surprising thing about all of this is how grateful I am now for David leaving, which sounds strange, I know, but if he'd stayed, if he'd never had the affair with Claire, I would still be that invisible, accommodating version of myself, slowly disappearing into a role that never quite fit. His betrayal was the catalyst that forced me to examine everything, to question all the assumptions I'd been living by, to rebuild from the ground up, according to my own values and desires, rather than inherited expectations. And while I wouldn't wish that kind of pain on anyone, I also can't regret the outcome, because it gave me this life I love now. I got to discover who Emma really was underneath all those layers of people-pleasing, and it turns out she's someone I actually like and respect and enjoy being. Someone with opinions and boundaries and creative interests, and the capacity for genuine partnership based on mutual respect, rather than one-sided accommodation. Marcus and I are talking about getting married eventually, though neither of us feels rushed about it. We know we're committed regardless of legal status, and we're enjoying this phase of building a life together without the pressure of traditional timelines or other people's expectations. When and if we do get married, it will be a small, intimate ceremony focused on what the commitment means to us, rather than performing for an audience. And I think I'll actually appreciate and understand my vows in a way I couldn't when I married David at 23, thinking love meant sacrifice and accommodation, rather than mutual growth and support. For now, I'm content with this partnership we've built. Waking up next to someone who genuinely likes me and wants to hear my thoughts and celebrates my successes and holds me through my occasional rough patches without trying to fix me or minimize my feelings. I still have difficult days, of course. Healing isn't linear, and sometimes grief or anger or regret surfaces unexpectedly, triggered by a song or a memory, or just the random fluctuations of being human. But those days are less frequent now, and less overwhelming. And I've learned to ride them out with self-compassion rather than judgment, to acknowledge the feelings without letting them define my present reality. I have tools now that I didn't have before, therapy strategies and support systems, and the hard-won knowledge that I can survive difficult emotions without being destroyed by them, and that resilience feels like one of the most valuable things I've gained through this whole experience. If you're going through something similar right now, if you're in the middle of that devastating betrayal, or that painful divorce, or that identity crisis of figuring out who you are outside a relationship that defined you, I want you to know it gets better in ways you can't imagine from where you're standing now. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick, and there will be days you don't think you can take another step forward. But if you keep moving even tiny increments at a time, if you're willing to do the hard work of examining yourself honestly and building genuine support systems, and gradually learning to trust your own judgment again, you will emerge on the other side as a fuller, more authentic version of yourself. The pain won't last forever, even though it feels endless in the moment, and eventually you'll look back and realize that what felt like the worst thing that ever happened to you was actually the beginning of your real life. And if this story has given you hope, or made you feel less alone, or inspired you to make changes in your own life, please subscribe to this channel, because building this community of people supporting each other through life's hardest transitions is what makes sharing these vulnerable stories worthwhile. And your subscription helps us reach that goal of 1,000 people who believe in authentic connection and honest storytelling. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for being part of this journey with me. And I hope whatever you're going through right now, you'll remember that you're stronger than you know, and you deserve relationships that see you completely and value you genuinely, and you have the capacity to rebuild something beautiful even from the most painful wreckage. That Thursday morning 4 years ago when I found David's note, I thought my life was ending. But it turns out it was just beginning. And the woman I've become through surviving and healing and growing is someone I'm genuinely proud to be. And that's worth everything I went through to get here.